And we have Dr. Adelheid Herrmann with us here today, who's about to talk to us about her work. She comes to us from the Alaska Center for Climate Assessment and Policy at University of Alaska Fairbanks in the International Arctic Research Center. Great. Thanks for being with us.
Yeah, thank you, Elise, and thank you, Elena, for inviting me. I'm going to turn off my camera and then I'll turn it back on when we get into discussion, if that's okay. So next slide, please. So I'll just tell you a little bit about my background. I grew up in the commercial fishing industry in the Bristol Bay area. I was born and raised there, and I started fishing at the age of 6 and then retired in 2012. And so I was already introduced somewhat, but I wanted to let you know about this tribal landscape work. It's a part of my bigger project on building capacity of rural communities to respond and adapt to climate change, focusing workforce development within tribal climate adaptation and mitigation planning. Next slide, please. So the purpose of this article, it's an 8-page brochure, is to inform researchers, academicians, federal and state agencies about the what is on the ground in rural Alaska as far as local capacity and the lifestyle of those living there. Tribes are also welcome to use it when trying to explain to others how they live and work in rural Alaska. Next slide, please. So this day in the life of Alaska tribe, I was working on this in the 1990s, and the reason it came about is I was talking to someone that was working in a rural community, and they were complaining to me that they hadn't heard back from a tribe. And I said, well, how did you contact them? And they said, we sent them a letter 2 weeks ago. So I thought I really need to show, those trying to work in rural Alaska, what the reality of what is actually happening out there. Explaining in words and graphics how busy the day-to-day life is of the people living there in reacting to many of these external forces that they're dealing with. And then I updated the graphic in 2019, working with Heather McFarland, our graphic artist. And not only did she help me update this graphic, but she also helped me put together this presentation as well as the brochure. Next slide, please. So in addition to, oftentimes reacting to the outside world, we also wanted to show what tribes or rural Alaskans have to deal with, sometimes on a daily basis. There's few community structures or lack of infrastructure, lack of housing, lack of elder care, lack of internet, high energy costs, and other issues that you can see highlighted here. Also, limited climate response training. And communities have been working on planning documents for years. There are so many plans, and whether they have been implemented or not is another question. But with the climate changing now, with the potential loss of life, lifestyles, livelihood, and subsistence resources, the adaptation planning, it needs to be more comprehensive, and solutions to these types of changes are very challenging. Next slide, please. So with all these external forces facing tribes and the internal stressors, people working in the community are often working several jobs, not only to make ends meet, but they may be the only ones doing much of the work in that community. So the abundance of funding opportunities coming out of this administration is very welcome, but to take advantage of the numerous opportunities, you have to have the capacity at the local level and regional levels to do this. And all of this is very challenging to step up to the plate, bring the funds home, and make sure the communities have the fiscal capacity to manage the grants. And then there's also the issue of navigating the complex governing systems, trying to work across governments and with regional and native corporations, trying to break down those silos. But it is a long and involved process. And there's good models out there of regions and villages doing this. But again, it's hard work and this may take years. Next slide, please. So this complex structure of Alaska Native entities, I have a few slides that I'll be talking about this. So if you want to go to the next slide, Elise. So tribes govern themselves. They are sovereign governments with a government-to-government special trust responsibility with the U.S. government. And don't expect tribes to be all the same. There may be similarities, but it's best to do your homework and find out more about the tribes and communities you'll be visiting, including what existing protocols that they may have for visitors or researchers. Next slide, please. So ANCSA Regional Corporations hold title to 44 million acres in Alaska. There's 174 Alaska Native Village corporations. And I hope all my statistics are pretty close. These corporations provide shareholder benefits, dividends, and educational resources. And next slide, please. And then the nonprofits organizations, they deliver services. So they provide healthcare services, social services, workforce development and educational services. Then they advocate on behalf of the region regarding the environment and other important issues. And then, of course, they work with their member tribes throughout their regions. Next slide, please. So Alaska Native Tribal Health Consortium and the Alaska Federation of Natives, they are their largest Alaska statewide Native organizations. And then on this slide, I'm going to just highlight something about the ENTHC. So they've done their unmet needs report, and I'm sure many of you have seen that. And this report reflects the critical importance of protecting Alaska Native communities and cultures on a national scale. And I'm going to just take information right out of the report. It says the magnitude and severity of this problem, and then they're talking about the extreme threat of climate change can be difficult to comprehend. In jeopardy are not just buildings, but the sustainability of entire communities and cultures. And then it goes on to mention that Alaska Native villages and Alaska Native cultures are a national treasure and something that you won't hear in the national media. And there are several entities working on helping tribes for grants, managing them, and so on. And one such program is the Alaska Federation of Natives Navigator Program. There's 12 navigators, one working in each region. And so far, it's been a really great model. But my personal opinion is that there can always be more resources provided. The Alaska Municipal League also has a system set up to help municipalities as well as tribes. And I believe that they're also working with the state infrastructure group. Next slide, please. So the next few slides, I'm going to talk about climate grief and wellness. Next slide, please. So climate change grief, there's a term for it. You can see there. So climate change in rural Alaska is personal, scary to have your house or cabin sink, be washed away or flooded out, and feeling helpless in the situation. The destruction of lifeways, subsistence, food, sacred lands. Food security is a huge concern, losing that access to marine mammals, fish, and other animals. And many of the animals now are developing different migration patterns, the animals and fish, which is cause for alarm in many communities. And the destruction of personal and community property, I mentioned the personal property issue, but community structures are threatened as well. Fuel tanks, harbors, schools, airports, and so on. And all of this, adds to historical and other trauma. I'm relating all of the external forces, internal stressors, then adding climate change issues on top of that. And it's absolutely exhausting. And then just a story, like after Kotzebue flooded out recently. I was watching on TV where a woman was talking about her daughter experiencing a new fear. And that was, the fear of the water coming in her house, and they were trying to evacuate. And since this is like people around the nation on this call, there was another instance where I was watching TV, and a national reporter was talking about Hurricane Milton, and he was describing, how hard it was going to hit, and he kind of broke down and got emotional. And so the response that he got from everybody across the nation, that people are fearful of the climate changing, and you see that throughout the nation and throughout the world. Next slide, please. So to combat some of these fears, I'm going to talk about healing and wellness rooted in cultures. So there's examples of resilience and wellness rooted in cultures all across Alaska and the world. There's many culture and traditional practices that incorporate healing and wellness strategies. And the ways of life of Alaska Native peoples are amazing amidst all this chaos. Life continues on and coping skills are developed over time. And this learning wellness strategies and creating communities of care and practice can help people stay engaged. And I want to mention one example here, and that's Melinda Chase, who developed the Alaska Tribal Resilience Learning Network. She saw the need in her trainings, working with communities, bringing them into Fairbanks and then going out to the communities. She saw the need to put the healing and wellness into these trainings. So she brought in Laverne Dementa, professor and chair of the UAF social work department. And Laverne has, for over 20 years, focused on wellness, healing-centered engagement, trauma-informed care and resilience, specifically with Indigenous populations. And she's also helping me with this whole article, or help me, and will help me with other work that we're doing at ACAP. Next slide, please. And so well-being in climate adaptation. Over the past decades, I've read reports on the Arctic, read through many notice of funding opportunities, congressional reports, and so on, and I've seen the term for the well-being of the Arctic residents. But then no one has ever really defined that, what that's meant. And the closest definition I could find is the one that you see here that Rachel Donkersloot worked on with a cohort around salmon. And I would caution people, if they see this term, make sure someone is defining it, and that it is acceptable to the rural communities. Next slide, please. So to wind down here, here are some takeaways from this article. That while all the funding and research is definitely needed, it can most definitely be very taxing and exhausting on local communities, regions, and even on us, some of us doing the work in this space. Hopefully there will be some mechanism for base funding for tribes on climate work, that federal policy realizes that providing funds to tribes for local administration and building capacity for climate adaptation is the foundation for tribes to then go after grants and build more capacity. And I realize already that tribes do get some base funding for their tribal governance and administration. Next slide, please. So you can email me, or you can download the graphics and with this QR code. And I just wanted to mention another project I have, and that's called the Fiscal Pathways Project through NOAA, where I'll be bringing in federal and state agencies and tribes to Dillingham, Alaska, to discuss disentangling of these funding opportunities and examining ways that may help tribes, and identifying some ways for federal and state agencies to work more in line with needs from the tribal perspective. And so contact me if there's anyone online that's from a federal or state agency that may want to attend this workshop in April of 2025. Next slide, please. So Janan, thanks for listening. And a lot of this is coming from my personal perspective, worldview, and living and working in rural Alaska. So I mentioned that no two tribes are alike or regions, but there's a lot of good work going on there. And I just want to thank ECAP too for allowing me to do this kind of work and having the flexibility of being based in Anchorage, going to Fairbanks once in a while and all around the state and nation and actually world. And then also being able to spend my summers in Bristol Bay. So I'll stop there and see if anybody has any comments or questions.
All right, if you have comments or questions, feel free to raise your hands using the hand raise function of Zoom, or you can type it in the chat and I can read it out loud. I'll put the link for Dr. Herrmann's graphics and the article in the chat here. Thank you so much. All right, what questions do we have?
I can call on somebody.
I have a question, Adelheid. So for people who would be trying to connect with tribes and work in the communities, and they don't know anybody in the village, what would your suggestions be in trying to connect in the right way?
Well, so they have to start with relationship building. You know, they do have to find somebody in the community that they can start talking to and do some relationship building. You know, contacting the tribe in the beginning, the city, you know, and sometimes the like the tribe, the local governments, and the corporations, sometimes they work together, sometimes they don't. So it would be good to contact you know, not just one entity, but different entities. And I was just on a webinar yesterday about, you know, respectful and relevant and mindful and engagement, you know. So eventually, I'd like to put together like a one pager on that. But connecting to the tribes, the tribal regional nonprofits would may be helpful as well.
Mhm. So connecting with those who are already working in the community and trying to understand, and I guess doing some homework about the community you want to work with, on whether the tribe and the other government, the city council, for example, works together or not.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And you know, there's different resources, you know, like I think the Inuit Circumpolar Council has done work on that. And there's Kina and Karina with their, it's called the ear, you know, all those people that are already doing that work, you can, that's some of your homework. There's a really good report coming out of the National Congress of American Indians too about tribes. And there's a some information about Alaska in there.
Yeah.
And
So
then,
yeah.
yeah, and then I presented the other day in a U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service training. They had a video on Alaska tribes, and it was excellent. Yeah.
Do they have that published on their website?
I'm not sure. I just happened to, when I was speaking there, I came in right before the video ended. And
Mhm. Yeah.
got a quite crowd today. I see Barrett's on. She does really, if that's Barrett Ristroff, if that's her, he does a lot of good work in rural Alaska too.
Good morning. No, it's a different Barrett, but thank you for the
Hey, sorry.
presentation.
Yeah.
Ask a question.
Go ahead, Annette.
Hi, thank you very much, Dr. Herrmann, for your presentation, which just confirms a lot of what I've read. And this is very, very helpful. My background is in climate sciences, and I'm doing a PhD right now. Would you say that it is very important to have the social work side in projects like climate adaptation, even mitigation, any kind of measures that try and involve First Nations or tribes like in Alaska? My project is with First Nations in Canada. But I see that part so important, and I'm on the physical science side, and I see that a lot of lecturers and colleagues have a really hard time understanding the social component and the relationship component in this, and so they don't get very far. Should we, from the very get-go, combine these approaches?
Yeah, thank you, Annette. I've been thinking a lot about this lately. I'm just like thinking over my lifetime, just like fishing, and then I was in the Alaska State Legislature, and just over time I've been advocating for Alaska Native peoples, and just seeing that real gap there between real life and academia, and then making what you're doing relevant, and so if you see this article, it doesn't have many citations. I wanted it to be useful to communities where they wouldn't have to go up and look up a citation and figure out what that means. So I think it is really important to think about the social piece of it, and as far as like defining what climate science resources are, um, when I came into my job, we had a cohort. There was two of us, and Elizabeth Figgis, she's working down in Cake, or she worked in Cake, and she built a Cake climate partnership between the city, the corporation, and the tribe. And so it was co-produced by all of those groups, and Elizabeth doing postdoc work. And what she, with all in the process, they figured that what they wanted to put into some of this co-production on their Cape Climate Partnership was things on well-being, and the social part of it. She didn't think about that going in, but that's some of what the community wanted, because it's important. Their well-being, looking at their subsistence resources, building new like clamming beds or whatever they were going to do. So yeah, it's very important, I think. It's kind of a mind shift, you have to look at other people's world views and see what's important to them. So yeah, thanks for the question. I hope that answer some of it. There's a lot to
Thank,
that. Yeah.
thank you. Yes, yes, it's very complex too, with the connection between well-being and resilience, obviously.
Yeah, and then also, Elena probably can talk more about this, but working in the schools too is important, that's a real good connection to the community.
Go ahead, Sarah.
Hi, Dr. Herrmann. Thank you so much for your talk. I really, it was really great to hear. My question is about a little bit about your fiscal pathways project and how that ties into this report. I'm curious. I'm just looking at the report now, and you mentioned funding obstacles. At least 20, like a recent report found at least funding obstacles in across 20 different programs. Do you see funding obstacles such as like managing multiple grants, grant writing, like capacity related challenges as something that individual scientists could address when starting to build relationships with communities? Or is that something that scientists can and should be lobbying, like the National Science Foundation or our institutions or whatnot to change? Or does my question make sense?
Yeah, it does, and I might not answer it fully like you want, but so the bigger project that I have working on workforce development, and then the fiscal pathways, they kind of tie in a little bit. There's a section like in the bigger project that I have on tribes, and this piece here was just a piece of that, the tribal landscapes. Actually, my boss said put a bow on something, so that's what I did there. But anyway, in the bigger project too, I'm looking at the federal agencies and all the funding coming in. And over time, it's been really challenging because every time I go to work on that section, I get absolutely overwhelmed because there is so much out there. And then there's such a lack of capacity on the local level. So I've been able to manage it some, but there's just it's like a fire hose coming at us with all this funding, and some people are stepping up to the plate really well, and others are, it's a challenge. And the AFN Navigator program is really helpful, and other people are helpful, but they're also getting in exhaustion mode, because there's just so much need out there. There's the Alaska Tribal Administrators Association too, that I went to their conference, and one of their high priorities was that they had lacking fiscal management, there was really a need for that. So I was thinking about, like, when I do work on the federal section of my bigger project, if I'm getting this overwhelmed, I can imagine at the local community level how overwhelming that is. And I know that the International Arctic Research Center, they put out information too, like, okay, here's some funding sources. Yeah, I don't know what the answers are yet, but hopefully the funding will continue. There's from the tribal perspective, the window of the funding opportunities is sometimes really short, and sometimes it happens like during fishing season or things like that. So hopefully in the fiscal pathways meeting, we'll get to talk with both the state and federal agencies and tribes and see what can come up or what can be done better. There's also the ACAP and NOAA and Alaska ANTHC have started kind of a relationship building group, and so we meet together, and they are also addressing some of these kinds of issues, what to do about them. And so at this tribal initiative gathering, the tribes presented, and then some of the federal agencies talked about it. But you have like you have the federal bureaucracy, which is really hard to tackle, for change. But people are in conversations about everything. That was kind of long-winded answer.
No, it was great. Thank you.
Great. Any other questions or comments?
I could probably talk about some things that are happening in Bristol Bay, just if people don't have any more questions. We have Bristol Bay Native Association and collaborators received a Climate Resilience Regional Challenge grant. And then also Igiagik received the same grant in the Bristol Bay area, and they're going to be looking at monitoring the region and putting guardians into subregions in Bristol Bay. And the Bristol Bay Native Association is going to work on a collaborative collaboration of groups in the Bristol Bay area looking at doing a climate adaptation plan. So we just got those 2 grants recently, and then we'll have like 4 fellows working on that as well. And so we need a workforce for all this work that's coming.
Any other questions or thoughts that people want to share? Go right ahead.
I see Margaret's online too. She might have some thoughts.
Way to call me out. I was eating.
She's done a lot of good work on co-production, and yeah. Any thoughts, Margaret?
I think something that you say that I also repeat, but to use a sense of like, go slow to go fast. And I think kind of that aspect, because I think you touched on it a little bit earlier with a question, but I think it's kind of like pretty relevant in that sense that it can be very frustrating to start building relationships because it's very slow process, and just like taking opportunities, and it's not something you can really like rush. You can't rush that aspect. And I think it just kind of like requires patience, which is like I think hard when you are in academia, because the timing of academia is like a different pace. And I think too that's somewhat which you a little bit like touched on too with like ACAP, and you and Elizabeth having that freedom with your postdocs to have that time to do that type of work and just like kind of slow down. And so I think about like a lot of that as like a model for how do you support people trying to do co-production, especially like early career folks.
Mhm. Yeah, I'm thinking about some of the other things like, you know, just waiting for people to, like, listening and waiting for people to talk, because, you know, it's taken me a while to just even get comfortable on Zoom. You know, I don't even know if I'm still comfortable on Zoom, but a lot of people, um, like in the Bristol Bay area, they don't even want the camera on, you know, so there's all kinds of things to think about in communities. And then in this one workforce development report that the National Congress of American Indians did, it talks about some of the politics of communities too. And there's a really good page there that shows, you know, like nepotism concerns, things that you know, you don't want to get into the politics of the community, because like village politics is really hard, the most personal, I think, and then state politics is kind of a breeze, and there's regional politics. So there's a lot of things to think about when you're going into these regions.
Yeah, I remember us talking about that when we participated in the workshop for the National Academies about co-production knowledge. But I also like to frame it too, the sense of like that's the case for every community. When you start working with any community, any, society, it's not unique to Indigenous people, but it's
Mhm.
something that's kind of, I think the power dynamics, if you come in who's not Indigenous, being like, well, it should be this way, that way, and stuff like that, then it's kind of like, that's a bit colonial. But I also like to honor the fact that, like, I think when you go do any kind of this like co-production knowledge, anything like that, there's always politics.
Yes, I agree.
All right. I was trying to give good teacher wait time there. But I think I don't see anything else. So I just have one more thing before we go, but thank you so much for joining us today, Dr. Herrmann, sharing your work, sharing your experience, discussing with us your work. I know I found it really insightful, and I hope everyone else really enjoyed it. I want to plug a couple upcoming events we have. We have 2 upcoming Learning Connect series. One in just a few weeks here, scenario storytelling with Dr. Katie Spellman. And then we'll have an inclusive mentoring workshop with Dr. Anna Gold in late January in anticipation of upcoming undergraduate research in the spring and summer months. And if everyone here today has just a minute to answer a couple questions on our event survey, I'll put the full link in the chat here. There's just a couple questions there. It'll just take you a couple minutes, and we would appreciate your feedback. So thanks for joining us today. Thank you, Dr. Herrmann, for sharing with us. I hope everyone has a lovely rest of their day.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye. Thank you.